My name is Trent Hayes, and I'm 45 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been the lead systems engineer for the Delta Defense Network at Blackwater Military Solutions. I built this orbital satellite system from the ground up, spending countless nights making sure every circuit, every line of code, and every backup protocol worked perfectly. My office on the 14th floor overlooks the sprawling Virginia campus, where America's most advanced defense technology comes to life. The Delta system wasn't just my job, it was my masterpiece. 24 satellites orbiting Earth, each one capable of detecting incoming missiles from over 2,000 miles away. The system could track, analyze, and coordinate defensive responses faster than any human could blink. It had never failed, not once in 8 years of operation. Every general, every defense contractor, every politician who mattered knew one thing. When it came to orbital defense, Trent Hayes was the guy who made it work. But that morning in March, everything changed when I got the email that would turn my world upside down. The message was simple. All department heads report to Conference Room Alpha at 0900 hours. It came from our CEO, Margaret Cross, and the formal tone told me something big was happening. I'd been through enough corporate reshuffles to know when the wind was shifting. As I walked through the halls that morning, I noticed other department heads whispering in small groups, their faces tight with worry. Conference Room Alpha was our biggest meeting space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Potomac River. When I entered, I saw all the usual faces, the heads of engineering, manufacturing, logistics, and finance. But there was someone new sitting at the head of the table, next to Margaret. He looked young, maybe late 30s, with perfectly styled brown hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His posture screamed confidence, the kind that comes from never having to prove yourself through actual work. Something about his smile made my stomach tighten. I had a feeling this man was about to change everything, and not for the better. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice carrying that forced enthusiasm executives use when delivering bad news. "I'd like you to meet our new Vice President of Defense Operations, Drayton Wellington." She gestured toward the young man, who stood up with a smile that never reached his eyes. Drayton stepped forward and adjusted his tie. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm excited to bring some fresh energy to this organization." His voice was smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this speech in a mirror. "I come from a background in corporate optimization and strategic restructuring. My goal is to streamline our operations and maximize our efficiency." I'd heard those words before. In my experience, when someone talked about streamlining and optimization, it usually meant they were about to cut things they didn't understand. The Delta system had taken over a decade to perfect, and every component had a purpose. But I could already see in Drayton's eyes that he was the type who would look at a masterpiece and see only ways to make it cheaper. Before I continue, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And be sure to click the like and subscribe button. Drayton continued his introduction, pulling up a presentation on the room's large screen. "I've spent the past week reviewing our current projects, and I have some concerns about cost efficiency." The slides showed budget breakdowns, mostly highlighting the Delta system's operational costs. "Some of our legacy programs are consuming resources that could be better allocated elsewhere." My hands tightened into fists under the table. Legacy programs? The Delta system was the crown jewel of American defense technology. It protected millions of people every single day, operating silently in the background while everyone slept safely in their beds. But to Drayton, it was just numbers on a spreadsheet. "I'll be working closely with each department to identify areas for improvement," he said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. There was something cold in that look, something that made me realize I was already in his crosshairs. "We need to ask ourselves hard questions about whether we're spending taxpayer money wisely." Margaret nodded along, but I could see the discomfort in her posture. She knew the Delta system's value, but she also knew that Drayton came with the backing of some very powerful people in Washington. Politics was about to trump expertise, and we all knew it. After the meeting, I walked straight to Drayton's temporary office. I needed to understand what he was planning for my system. His door was open, and he was on the phone, speaking in that same polished tone. "Yes, Senator, I understand the budget constraints completely. We'll find the savings you need." When he hung up, I knocked on the doorframe. "Drayton? I'm Trent Hayes, lead engineer for the Delta Defense Network. I was hoping we could talk about the system's operational requirements." He gestured for me to sit, but his attention was already drifting to his computer screen. Right, the satellite thing. I've been looking at those numbers, Trent. 24 satellites, round-the-clock monitoring, dedicated ground stations. Seems like overkill to me. Those satellites protect the entire continental United States, I said, keeping my voice level. Every component is essential for maintaining coverage and redundancy. Drayton leaned back in his chair, that same cold smile spreading across his face. Here's the thing, Trent. I've run the numbers, and I think we can do the same job with half the satellites and a quarter of the staff. It's all about efficiency. My heart started pounding. He was talking about dismantling 12 years of work based on a week of spreadsheet analysis. Drayton, with respect, you can't just cut satellites and expect the same coverage, I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. The Delta system works because of its redundancy. If we lose satellites, we create blind spots. If we cut staff, we lose the expertise needed to maintain the system. He waved his hand dismissively. Look, I get that you're attached to your project, but we're in a new era. We need to do more with less. The Pentagon is asking for budget cuts, and we need to deliver. I pulled out my tablet and showed him the system's performance data. This system has prevented 17 potential threats in the past 5 years. Not one missile has gotten through our detection grid. Our uptime is 99.97%. Drayton barely glanced at the screen. That's great, but the question is, could we have stopped those same threats with a smaller system? I think the answer is yes. He stood up, signaling the conversation was over. I'll be reviewing the Delta budget over the next few days. We'll need to find some significant savings. As I left his office, I knew I was fighting for more than just my job. I was fighting for a system that kept America safe, and the person making decisions about it cared more about spreadsheets than national security. Over the next week, Drayton scheduled meetings with every member of my team. He called them efficiency consultations, but I knew what they really were. Interrogations designed to find ways to cut costs. My engineers started coming to me with worried faces, asking if their jobs were safe. He asked me if the overnight monitoring was really necessary, said Natalia Wyatt, my lead satellite communications specialist. I tried to explain that threats don't follow business hours, but he just kept asking about cost savings. David Rodriguez, my systems analyst, was even more shaken. He wanted to know if we could replace our custom software with some commercial program he found online. I told him our software handles classified protocols, but he said maybe we were overcomplicating things. Each conversation made it clearer that Drayton had no understanding of what we actually did. To him, the Delta system was an expensive piece of technology that needed to be made cheaper. He couldn't grasp that some things, especially things that protect human lives, shouldn't be cut to the bone just to save money. I spent that week documenting everything, preparing detailed reports that explained why every aspect of the Delta system was critical. I hoped that facts and data might change his mind. The following Monday, Drayton called an all-hands meeting for the entire Delta team. We gathered in the main conference room, all 15 of us who had spent years perfecting this system. Drayton walked in with a stack of folders and that same confident smile. Thank you all for your patience during this review process, he began. I've completed my analysis, and I have some exciting news about the future of the Delta Defense Network. Exciting news. The words sent a chill down my spine. We're going to be implementing some strategic changes that will make us more competitive and cost-effective. He opened one of the folders. First, we're reducing the satellite constellation from 24 to 12 units. Second, we're transitioning to automated monitoring systems that will reduce our staffing needs by 60%. The room fell silent. I looked around at my team, engineers who had dedicated their careers to this system, who knew every circuit and every line of code. Their faces showed the same shock I was feeling. Drayton, I said, standing up, those changes would fundamentally compromise the system's effectiveness. We've discussed this. His smile faded, and for the first time, I saw something like annoyance in his eyes. Trent, I appreciate your input, but the decision has been made. Made by who? I asked. Because the generals who depend on this system haven't signed off on these changes. Neither has the Pentagon Oversight Committee. The room was completely quiet now. Everyone could feel the tension building between Drayton and me. He set down his folder and crossed his arms. The decision was made by senior management, Trent, including me. That's how chains of command work. His voice was getting harder, less polished. Now, I need everyone to start thinking about how we implement these changes efficiently. I can't support changes that will put American lives at risk, I said. The Delta system works because it's been designed and tested by people who understand orbital defense. You're talking about gutting it based on budget projections. Drayton's face was turning red now. Are you questioning my authority, Trent? I'm questioning your judgment, I replied. And I'm asking you to reconsider before you destroy something that's taken 12 years to build. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Drayton looked around the room at my team, then back at me. When he spoke again, his voice was ice cold. Trent Hayes, you're terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The room exploded in shocked whispers. I stood there for a moment, not quite believing what had just happened. Then I saw the faces of my team, Natalia, David, and the others who had worked beside me for years. They looked devastated. You can't fire me, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. My contract requires approval from the Pentagon Oversight Committee for termination. Drayton smiled that cold smile again. Check your email, Trent. That approval came through an hour ago. He was lying, and we both knew it, but he had the backing of powerful people. Sometimes that's all that matters in Washington. Security arrived within minutes. 2 guards I'd known for years who looked uncomfortable with their assignment. Sorry, Trent. One of them whispered as they escorted me to my office to collect my personal belongings. As I packed my few personal items, I could hear Drayton addressing my team in the conference room. His voice carried through the thin walls. I know this is a difficult transition, but we need team players who are committed to our new direction. When I walked out of the building for the last time, I carried only a small box of personal items. But I also carried something else, the complete technical specifications for the Delta Defense Network, legally obtained and stored on encrypted drives that were mine to keep as the system's original architect. That night, I sat in my home office staring at my computer screen. The encrypted files contained 12 years of work. Every schematic, every protocol, every line of code that made the Delta system work. Drayton thought he could cut costs and maintain effectiveness, but he was about to learn a hard lesson about the difference between theory and reality. I opened my contacts list and started making phone calls. First, I called Natalia Wyatt. Natalia, it's Trent. I know today was difficult, but I want you to know that this isn't over. Trent, I'm so sorry about what happened. It was completely unfair. Her voice was shaky. Drayton wants us to start decommissioning satellites next week. He says the remaining 12 can handle the load. Natalia, I need you to document everything. Every change, every modification, every corner they cut. Can you do that for me? Of course, but why? Because when this system fails, and it will fail, someone needs to have a record of exactly what they did wrong. I made similar calls to David and the other senior engineers. None of them were happy with the changes Drayton was implementing, but they all needed their jobs. I understood that, and I didn't ask them to do anything that would put their positions at risk. Over the next 2 weeks, I monitored the Delta system from the outside. As a former Department of Defense contractor, I still had access to certain public reports about system status and performance. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Drayton had moved fast with his changes. 12 satellites had been decommissioned and were now sitting silent in orbit. The remaining satellites were being pushed harder to cover the gaps, operating beyond their design parameters. The automated monitoring system he'd implemented was already showing problems, missed signals, false alerts, and response delays that would have been unacceptable under the old system. I started documenting everything, creating a detailed timeline of system degradation. Each day brought new problems, but Drayton was apparently reporting to the Pentagon that everything was running smoothly. He was cooking the books, hiding problems to make his cost-cutting measures look successful. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, everything changed. I was drinking coffee and reading the news when my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. The alerts were vague, something about a technical issue with defense systems, but I knew exactly what was happening. The Delta Defense Network was failing. I drove straight to Blackwater's offices, my heart pounding as I listened to emergency broadcasts on the radio. The news was calling it a temporary communications disruption, but the truth was much worse. The Delta system wasn't just having communications problems, it was blind. When I arrived at the building, I could see the chaos through the windows. People were running between offices, phone calls were happening in every corridor, and I could hear shouting from the upper floors. I used my old access card to enter through a side entrance, hoping it hadn't been deactivated yet. I made it to the 14th floor and headed straight for the Delta control room. Through the glass doors, I could see my former team working frantically at their stations. Status displays that should have shown green lights were flashing red across the board. Natalia saw me through the glass and ran over. "Trent, thank God you're here. The system is completely down. We've lost contact with 16 satellites." 16? I thought Drayton only decommissioned 12. He did, but the remaining ones are failing because they're overloaded. The automated monitoring system couldn't handle the increased workload, and now we're getting cascade failures. Through the control room windows, I could see Drayton in the corner, shouting into his phone. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and sweat stains were visible under the arms of his expensive shirt. I pushed through the doors into the control room. "Natalia, show me the failure cascade." She pulled up the system diagnostics on her screen, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The Delta network wasn't just failing, it was collapsing in exactly the way I had predicted. The automated system couldn't differentiate between routine maintenance signals and actual system alerts, Natalia explained, her voice tight with stress. So it started shutting down satellites as a precaution. Now we have massive coverage gaps over the East Coast and the Midwest. Drayton noticed me and stormed over. "What the hell are you doing here, Hayes? You were terminated. Your system is failing," I said simply. "And right now, I'm the only person who knows how to fix it." "We don't need you," Drayton snapped. "My team can handle this." I gestured toward the wall of red warning lights. "Really? Because it looks like your team isn't over their heads." I turned to Natalia. "How long have you been down?" "For hours," she replied. "And it's getting worse." Drayton's phone rang, and I could hear shouting from the other end, even though he hadn't put it on speaker. His face went pale as he listened. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "That was the Pentagon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're demanding answers." "Here's your answer," I said, pointing at the diagnostic screens. "You cut the system's redundancy in half and replaced human oversight with automated protocols that weren't designed for this workload. The satellites are failing because they're being pushed beyond their limits." Drayton was sweating now, the confident executive facade completely gone. "Can you fix it?" "I can try, but I'll need complete access to all systems and the authority to override your automated protocols." He hesitated, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. His political connections had gotten him this job, but they wouldn't save him if the Delta Defense Network collapsed on his watch. "Fine," he said. "Do whatever you need to do." I turned to my former team. "Natalia, I need you to manually restart the diagnostic protocols. David, start bringing the backup satellites online, the ones Drayton had marked for decommission. Everyone else, switch to manual monitoring. We're going back to the old system." For the next 6 hours, I worked alongside the engineers I had trained, slowly bringing the Delta network back online. It was like performing surgery on a patient who was bleeding out. One wrong move could make everything worse. By evening, we had restored partial coverage, but the system was still fragile. 8 satellites were completely offline and would need weeks of work to repair. The automated monitoring system had caused so much damage that we'd essentially have to rebuild large portions of the network from scratch. As news of the failure spread, the phone calls started coming in. First from Pentagon officials, then from senators, then from the defense contractors who depended on the Delta system. Each call was angrier than the last, and each one ended with the same demand: "Get Trent Hayes back on the job." I was in the control room when Margaret Cross, the CEO, arrived with a group of military officials I didn't recognize. She walked straight over to me, ignoring Drayton completely. "Trent, I apologize for what happened. We made a mistake." She gestured toward the officials. "General Morrison from the Pentagon would like to speak with you." General Morrison was a tall, gray-haired man with the kind of presence that commanded instant respect. "Mr. Hayes, we have a serious situation here. The Delta Defense Network is critical to national security, and we can't afford any more failures." "I understand, General. The system can be repaired, but it's going to take time and resources." "Whatever you need," he said. "Cost is not a concern. We need this system operational, and we need someone in charge who knows what they're doing." Drayton, who had been standing silently in the corner, finally spoke up. "General, I'm still the Vice President of Defense Operations." "Not anymore. General Morrison cut him off. As of today, you're reassigned to administrative duties. Within a week, I was back in my old office with a new title, Director of Defense Systems Engineering. My salary was double what it had been before, and I had complete authority over the Delta network and any future defense projects. More importantly, I had the backing of the Pentagon and a direct line to the highest levels of military command. The first thing I did was rehire my entire team at significantly higher salaries. Natalia became my deputy director, David was promoted to lead systems analyst, and everyone who had been forced to implement Drayton's disastrous changes got recognition for their expertise and dedication. Rebuilding the Delta network took 3 months. We didn't just restore it to its original capabilities, we improved it, adding new satellites and upgrading the ground-based monitoring systems. The new Delta Defense Network was more powerful and more reliable than ever before. But the most satisfying part of my new position wasn't the technical work or the restored system. It was the administrative structure that the Pentagon had put in place to prevent another disaster like the one Drayton had caused. According to my new contract, all major defense projects had to be approved through a strict oversight process. Any changes to existing systems required sign-off from both the Pentagon and the lead engineer. And here's where it got interesting. Due to budget allocation procedures, every contract and payment related to defense systems had to be processed through the Vice President of Defense Operations. That was still Drayton Wellington. His administrative duties turned out to be a very specific kind of administration. He was responsible for processing and approving every purchase order, every contract payment, and every budget allocation that came through my department. In other words, Drayton, the man who had fired me and tried to destroy my life's work, now had to personally approve every dollar that funded my success. The first test came when I submitted a requisition for new satellite components. The purchase order was for $50 million, and it landed on Drayton's desk on a Tuesday morning. I had included detailed technical specifications that proved the components were essential for maintaining system integrity. Drayton had 2 choices: approve the purchase and fund the system he had tried to destroy, or reject it and face questions from Pentagon officials who were watching his every move. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. That afternoon, Drayton appeared at my office door. He looked terrible, thinner than before, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made his hands shake slightly. "Trent, about this satellite component order," he began, holding up the requisition forms. "What about it?" I asked, not looking up from my computer. $50 million seems like a lot for replacement parts. I turned to face him, keeping my expression neutral. "Those aren't replacement parts, Drayton. They're upgrades to prevent the kind of system failures that happened under your management. The Pentagon specifically requested these improvements." He shifted uncomfortably. "I just want to make sure we're spending wisely. The same way you spent wisely when you cut the satellite constellation in half." I asked, "How did that work out?" Drayton's face flushed red, but he didn't respond. He signed the purchase order with shaking hands and placed it on my desk. "There," he said. "Approved." "Thank you," I said, filing the signed order in a special folder I kept locked in my desk. "I'm sure there will be many more orders like this one." The look in his eyes told me he understood exactly what I meant. Over the following months, Drayton signed dozens of purchase orders for my department. Each one was larger than the last, and each one represented another piece of the expanded defense network I was building. Software upgrades, hardware improvements, additional satellites, new ground stations. Everything Drayton had once called wasteful spending was now being funded with his signature. The irony was perfect. The man who had fired me for cost overruns was now personally authorizing expenditures that dwarfed anything from my original budget. And he had no choice in the matter. Every purchase was backed by Pentagon requirements and overseen by officials who remembered his disastrous attempt to cut corners. I kept every signed purchase order in my locked desk drawer. They weren't just business documents. They were trophies. Each signature represented Drayton's acknowledgement that I had been right all along, that the Delta Defense Network required the resources and expertise he had tried to eliminate. The best part was watching him realize that his position wasn't temporary. The Pentagon had made it clear that continuity in defense operations was critical, and that meant maintaining the existing administrative structure. Drayton was trapped in a job that forced him to fund my success every single day. As the months passed, The Delta Defense Network became more advanced than I had ever imagined possible. With unlimited Pentagon backing and a budget that grew with each new threat assessment, I was able to implement technologies that had only been theoretical before my firing. We added quantum encrypted communication links between satellites, installed AI-assisted threat analysis systems, and created redundant coverage that could handle multiple simultaneous attacks. The network that Drayton had tried to reduce to 12 satellites now included 36, with plans for 12 more. Every improvement required Drayton's approval, and every approval was another small victory. I would submit purchase orders with detailed technical explanations that I knew he couldn't understand, forcing him to sign documents authorizing technologies that were far beyond his comprehension. "Trent," he said one day, appearing at my door with another stack of requisitions, "some of these orders are getting really specific. Do we really need quantum-hardened orbital relay transceivers?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Unless you want to explain to General Morrison why our satellites can't communicate during a quantum interference attack." He had no idea what quantum interference was, but he knew he couldn't afford to question Pentagon-approved technology. He signed the order without another word. The turning point came during a congressional hearing on defense spending. I was called to testify about the Delta Defense Network's capabilities and budget requirements. Drayton was there too, sitting at the witness table as the administrative officer responsible for approving my department's expenditures. Senator Patricia Williams, who chaired the Defense Appropriations Committee, asked the question I had been waiting for. "Mr. Hayes, we understand there was a significant system failure earlier this year. Can you explain what happened?" I had prepared for this moment. "Senator, the failure occurred when cost-cutting measures reduced the satellite constellation from 24 to 12 units and replaced human oversight with inadequate automated systems. The result was a cascade failure that left critical coverage gaps for over 8 hours. "And who authorized these cost-cutting measures?" she asked. I glanced at Drayton, who was staring at his hands. "Those decisions were made by the Vice President of Defense Operations, Drayton Wellington, without consulting the engineering team or seeking Pentagon approval." The senator turned to Drayton. "Mr. Wellington, is that accurate?" Drayton mumbled something about efficiency improvements, but his words were barely audible. The damage was done. The entire committee now understood that he had nearly compromised national security to save money. "Mr. Hayes," Senator Williams continued, "what resources do you need to ensure this never happens again?" "Senator, with proper funding and oversight, the Delta Defense Network can be expanded to provide unprecedented protection for American interests. I've submitted a comprehensive proposal for a next-generation system that would make us virtually immune to ballistic missile attacks." The congressional hearing was a complete vindication. Within weeks, my budget was increased by 300%, and I was given authority to expand the Delta network into a comprehensive orbital defense system. The project would take 5 years and cost over $2 billion. Every contract, every payment, every budget allocation would require Drayton Wellington's signature. I moved into a new office suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Potomac River. My team grew from 15 engineers to over 200 of the brightest minds in aerospace defense. We were building something unprecedented, a defense network that could protect not just America, but our allies around the world. Drayton's office, meanwhile, had been moved to the basement level. His title remained the same, but his responsibilities had been reduced to processing paperwork for projects he had once tried to destroy. He spent his days reviewing technical documents he couldn't understand, signing purchase orders for technologies beyond his imagination. I made a point of delivering the most important contracts to him personally. There was something deeply satisfying about watching him sign a $500 million satellite contract, knowing that each stroke of his pen represented his complete defeat. 1 year after my firing, I was invited to a Pentagon ceremony honoring excellence in defense innovation. The Delta Defense Network had become the model for 21st century missile defense, and I was receiving the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of generals, senators, and defense officials, I reflected on how much had changed. A year ago, Drayton Wellington had fired me in front of my entire team, calling me a perfectionist who didn't understand budget constraints. Now he sat in the back row, watching as I was honored for the very work he had tried to eliminate. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of expertise in national defense, about the dangers of letting politics override engineering, and about the need to trust the people who actually understand the systems that keep us safe. Defense systems aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, I said, looking directly at Drayton. They're the difference between safety and catastrophe, between protection and vulnerability. When we cut corners on defense, we don't just risk money, we risk lives. The audience gave me a standing ovation. Drayton remained seated, his face expressionless. After the ceremony, he approached me in the corridor outside the auditorium. "Congratulations, Trent," he said, extending his hand. "You deserve this recognition." I shook his hand, feeling the tremor in his grip. "Thank you, Drayton. I couldn't have done it without your support." Today, 3 years after Drayton Wellington fired me, the Delta Defense Network is recognized as the most advanced missile defense system in the world. We've prevented dozens of potential threats, protected American interests on 6 continents, and created a model that other nations are eager to adopt. My team has grown to over 500 people working across multiple facilities. We're developing next-generation technologies that were science fiction when I first started this project. Quantum sensors, AI-powered threat assessment, orbital manufacturing capabilities. We're building the future of defense technology. And every single day, Drayton Wellington signs the purchase orders that make it all possible. He still holds the title of Vice President of Defense Operations, but everyone knows what he really is. The man who tried to destroy America's best defense system and ended up being forced to fund its expansion. His signature appears on contracts worth billions of dollars, each one a reminder of his spectacular failure of judgment. I keep a special file in my office safe containing every document he's signed since my reinstatement. Hundreds of contracts, thousands of purchase orders, billions of dollars in funding for the project he once called wasteful. It's the most complete record of professional humiliation I've ever seen. Sometimes I'll pull out one of those early purchase orders, the $50 million satellite components he approved with shaking hands, and remember the look in his eyes when he realized what his future held. He knew then that he would spend the rest of his career funding my success, signing check after check with my name on it. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I found it's even better when served with the enemy's signature. Thanks for watching this incredible story of professional vindication. If you enjoyed this tale of justice served, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories, and let me know in the comments what you thought about Drayton getting what he deserved. Your support means everything, and I'll see you in the next video.